Thanks everybody for coming out. We're going to talk about building a business on Python, which hopefully isn't too misleading of a title. I guess the idea is I want to talk about business because I do more of that than I do Python these days, but my background is I'm a Python engineer. And spend some time talking about my experience, the company that I've built, how that ties back to my programming background. And more than anything, I thought, I could go really deep on a lot of stuff, or I could go really shallow and spend more time with Q&A. And so I think that's kind of really the format I opted for, was to tell you a little bit about my story, give you just kind of a brief overview of different businesses that are out there that you can leverage your Python skills for, and then open it up for us to do some Q&A. Sound good to everybody? Sweet. So I'm a Python developer, have been for most of my career. I'm co-organizer of this group here at FayettePy. I'm one of the hosts on a podcast we record here at the office called Friday Afternoon Deploy. And I am the founder and CEO of a company called Lofty, which is where you are today. So I'll do like this super quick, my story, because it's not that remarkable. Okay, I was an English major for some reason. I was also a tinkerer in web programming. So I was a child of the internet. I'm an elder millennial. And so I grew up building GeoCities and Tripod and AngelFire websites. When I was in middle school, I got into it. And by the time I was in high school, I was tinkering with some very early PHP stuff. Gross. And so I went into college. I started as an English major, and I was building websites on the side to fund my way through college. And then one day I was like, wait a minute, I have no idea how I'm going to make money as an English major, but I'm making money right now building websites. So I switched to computer science about halfway through, and actually ended up taking this job as a web developer at the Log Cabin Democrat in Conway, Arkansas, and accidentally dropped out of college. Actually, I didn't drop out of college. I just didn't go back one day. So I probably owe someone money, and I have no idea what my GPA is. But I was going to take a semester off, and then I kept having work to do and just kind of worked at it. I was really fortunate to get in to programming in a very non-traditional industry, which meant that no one in the newspaper business cared if I had a degree, so they never asked about it. And then I worked there long enough, and the next job never asked me about the degree again, and I thought, oh, okay. So I just kept going. I actually totally regret not finishing my degree just because, I was pretty close to it. But so I got lucky in that regard. So I worked in the newspaper industry. That's a weird industry to do computer programming in, but it actually helped me out in a lot of ways that I realized after the fact. After that, I went to consulting. I got a consultant job with a company called M&S Consulting. My group was based out of Cincinnati, Ohio, and that was my first taste of consulting, client services, like service-based agency model. And we were doing web programming. We were building apps for other companies. After that, I went back to the newspaper industry for the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette as their lead developer and built a lot of infrastructure tools out for them. The Democrat-Gazette is the flagship newspaper for a holding company called Waco that owns about a dozen other newspapers. So the DemGaz kind of, from a tech perspective, functions as corporate, and we were building out the tools that all the other newspapers were using. So we're actually building more like robust systems there. I left that, took a job in Clearwater, Florida that I regret. I went back to PHP. I had started doing Python at the Democrat Gazette. I lied. They had bought this CMS that was built on this framework called Django that no one had ever heard of, but that was actually invented in the newspaper industry. They bought this framework called Ellington, which was made by the original newspaper where Django was invented. Ellington was their commercial thing that they were going to sell to other newspapers, and so they bought that and needed support, and I saw the job description, and it was like, some of it's PHP, which I knew, and some of it's in Python, and I thought, I could probably pick that up. So I lied and said, yeah, I know Python. Got the job, and I leaned on PHP until I built my Python skills up. And then I left that job. I went to Studio 98, a little product company down in Florida, And it was back to full-time PHP, and I hated every second of it. I wanted back in Python so bad. I had used PHP as a crutch, and then when I didn't have Python anymore, it was miserable. And so I started moonlighting, tinkering on freelance projects with people, writing those in Python, until I moved to Celerity as a consultant in their web and mobile solutions in Washington, D.C. That was purely Python. They worked exclusively with the media industry as well. So PBS, National Geographic, Smithsonian, Discovery, these were the big clients that they were serving. Python and Django, super popular out in DC in the media industry. So I did that for a long time. That was my real consulting agency job. It's like a 1,000-person agency, which is pretty big for an agency. And then I got enticed to go try out this CTO thing with a startup in New York called Your Guru, which was an app product startup. And that was kind of my first taste of actually being closer to the business, being at the C level of a very, very small, very, very early stage startup that fizzled out very quickly. So it wasn't really business. It was more like a couple people pretending, playing business, like a tea party with little kid friends around a board table kind of thing. I learned a lot. Yeah. I learned a lot of bad lessons there. Yeah. And so one day I quit my CTO job and said I'm never working for anyone else ever again because my CEO was a jerk, like a big jerk. And so that was my first taste of that, just a super ego-driven, crazy executive. And admittedly, super naively thought, well, I just don't want to work for people again. I can do that. I can do what he was doing. I can go start a company, or I've been doing some freelancing work, and said, yeah, I want to try that. That's how burned I was by that experience. And so in 2014, I was freelancing, and my job title was Python freelancer. That's what I went out and branded myself. I'm a free agent. I write Python code. That's what I do hiring. And I was, I had the benefit of leveraging, I had a previous network in consulting. And so I went straight out to some of the clients that we had worked with, made sure that I wasn't violating any of our contracts between our companies on non-solicitation and stuff, which turns out we were, but we worked it out. And I got a 3-month contract and jumped straight into it. And I didn't pay attention to the terms of the contract because I was hungry and I wanted to go. And I didn't notice that it was net 60. I also didn't know what net 60 meant. I don't know if you know what net 60 means, but we'll talk about it in a bit. And that's when I learned about cash flow. So we'll talk about some of these terms later. Net 60, you deliver an invoice and they pay you 60 days later. The problem is that I had to work for a month to bill up the hours to deliver the invoice. So it turned out from the first day I went to work on that contract, it was 90 days before I got a paycheck again. And I didn't have very much savings. So cash flow, learned that very quickly. I guess the theme here is on my path, the hard ways I learned some lessons. Late 2014, I incorporated something called Lofty Labs. And that was a name that I picked out of the blue. Actually, my personal accountant said, there are some very minor tax benefits if you incorporate this thing and do it this way. Okay, cool. And it was around that time, after I did that incorporation, that I started seeing what a lot of people who do freelancing call a feast or famine cycle. I mean, you were either drowning in work and stressed out, or desperate for work because you weren't getting paid. You eat what you kill as a freelancer. And so my reaction to that was just to go out and drum up work as fast as I could. And then something happened. I accidentally double booked myself. So I was so scared of going hungry that I started lining myself up for more than one job just in case one fell through. And I had a contract that was set to expire. I picked up a 1-year contract. It was awesome, sweet, long-term deal. And then the contract that I was on renewed for a year. They came back around and said, no, we want you for a full year. So suddenly I had 2 years of work that ran concurrently. And I was like, oh, what do I do now? I think I'm not a freelancer anymore. And now I incorporated this company. And so I just stumbled and said, well, I'm a consultancy now. And so I brought on a subcontractor. I I had moved up here to Fayetteville. I had met some people that were doing Python development. And so I said, hey, you want to come do some work? I've got a project. It's all lined up. We'll split the rate on it, and I just started going that direction. And that's when I learned about margins. Because I didn't really know how to price myself as a freelancer. I sure as hell didn't know how to price a business that now had an expense. See, I had this harebrained idea that once this worked and I managed to get myself booked up with like way too much work, I thought, okay, maybe I can line up work for contractors and manage it all and keep things coming in. And I will take a percentage of the rate, right? That's how the consulting business works. A percentage will go to me for running the business and all the operations around it, and another percentage will go to other people. And I really wrestled with, I had some guilt over that, of what am I worth? What's my time worth? What should I charge? What should my portion of the rate be? And I finally settled at, well, I'll keep 25%. I'll pay out 75% of the rate. I'll advocate really hard to get a better rate for these people so that they're getting paid well. And I felt a lot of guilt, actually, over that 25%. Seemed like a lot. Seemed like more than, but I thought, if I do that, if I can keep 4 people busy full-time, then my job can be keeping that machine running, and I'll be making the same as if I were working full-time at that bill rate. I'm keeping 25% of 4 people. That's my 100%. That keeps me employed, and I keep that going. And yeah, I learned about margins then. That was super naive. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the numbers on it. Yeah, we never got there. Keeping 4 people really, really busy, all the time, in and out, 24 hours a day or 52 weeks a year. That's more than one person's full-time job, it turns out. It took a lot more than that. But by 2016, we had kind of learned a little bit of that. Our margins were a little bit better. We had 2 pretty significant long-term contracts with 1 or more people full-time on it. I hired some people. I hired one of our contractors. Moved to a real office. I call it. And this was our first office in 2015. It was my brother split the rent with me, and he worked remotely. He didn't work for us, but we split it, and we had this little thing. This is up above Damn Good Pies, and the air conditioning in here, the vent for the brick pizza ovens at Damn Good Pies is right on the other side of that. So it smelled like burnt pizza all day, every day. And so that was the first office. Then I said, well, this office doesn't smell like pizza, so that must be a real office. We moved to the Pryor Center, had a little bit more space. And at that point, our positioning had changed. Now, Lofty Labs was a real company. We had real employees, and we were Python experts. That's why you hired Lofty Labs, is you needed expert Python consulting. And that's where we were around them. And then fast forwarding through a bunch, you can ask me a bunch of questions about the middle time, but we changed our positioning. This is something I started to learn really quickly, is that branding ourselves as Python experts wasn't actually the best way to position a company out in the market, even though that's what we liked and what we were really good at. It sort of, by necessity, put us in front of a very select set of customers, who were customers that already had engineers, had already selected Python as their technology, and they were hiring us to just be extra hands on deck. And it's really hard to run a business that charges for the people that get paid to do the work, plus a margin to keep the business running, when the cost comparison on the customer side is, we already have Python engineers, we know what they cost, why would we pay more for you? That was really difficult to do. We figured that out the hard way and started positioning ourselves not as Python experts. Python was what we did, but we were solving problems. And we tried to solve a lot of different problems over these years. We solved data problems for a little while. We solved, at some point very early on, we were actually doing a bunch of CMS work. Because Django was really good at that kind of stuff. And so what problem we were solving any given month as we were trying to find the right market for us changed over time. But that was the main change there, is we stopped calling ourselves Python experts and instead saying we are experts in some problem space. It just so happened that we use Python to solve it. And that made things a lot better. A lot has changed over those years. These days, our positioning is even more changed. We rebranded the company just a couple months ago to Lofty, and we're really focused on data-driven applications. That's what we say these days. Data-driven applications for disruptive companies. So that's the business I started. You guys can ask me questions about that, and more stuff will come out. But that's my background. That's how I know all the things that I'm going to tell you. That's my flimsy justification for why you should listen to me. I'm going to give you a 2-minute MBA. I assume. I don't know because I don't have one. And so this is what I think would be in a 2-minute MBA. I mentioned a couple of these terms. How to read a P&L is actually really, really important. And I didn't know that when I started. And it's not actually about reading the profit and loss statement and understanding the financials. It's understanding that there's a lot of meaning behind each of these terms and how you categorize your expenses that would have taught me a lot of things. So just going through it quickly, revenue is, sometimes you call it top line, right? But it's the top line of a P&L sheet. All your revenues at the top. You start with, this is your gross sales, all the money you brought in. So when people say things like, I built a $2 million company, probably means $2 million in revenue. That is not what got taken home at the end of the day. That's their gross volume of dollars coming in the door. Below that on a P&L, you have your cost of goods sold, or in a different type of business like ours, a services business, your cost of services. Those are the expenses that your business has to pay out that are directly required to fulfill the sales you made here, right? So you sell all this stuff, and then you have to. There's some amount of cost. So if you're a retail store, your cost of goods sold is your inventory, right? You had to buy the stuff to put it on the shelf before you sold it to someone else. And an attribute of cost of goods sold is it's kind of hard to change. That is something that tends to be relatively fixed in your business model. You can find a cheaper supplier or things like that, but for the most part, you can't take something that was a cost of goods sold and say, we don't have to pay that anymore to sell services. Then you have your gross margin below that. Your gross margin is a ratio of your revenue to cost of goods sold, right? So you make the math easy, $1 million in revenue, $400,000 cost of goods sold, you have a 60% gross margin. 60% of your revenue goes into what is known as your gross profit. So gross profit, revenue minus cost of goods sold. It's called gross profit. It's still not profit. In fact, there tend to be, and depending on the types of businesses, it changes, but your operating expenses, or what people refer to as their overhead, is expenses that aren't directly related to the product that you sold, but they are necessary expenses to operating the business that enables you to go sell that product. Overhead is easier to change than cost of goods sold. It's not necessarily that this one's impossible and that one's simple, but typically it's a lot easier to cut overhead, right? If you hear that term, and that is just the nature of things. If you cut stuff over here, you have less to sell. If you cut stuff over here, you can still sell the same as much, but somehow you can manage to sell it cheaper. And then finally, bottom of the P&L sheet, net profit. This is your gross profit minus your operating expenses, right? So that is like the income that the shareholders of the company actually see is what's coming out. And that is referred to as the bottom line. So when we say, that affects the bottom line, that means it's adding to my overhead and it's making this number smaller, right? This is top line revenue, or like this is going to really drive the top line. You're adding new sales at the top. So that's where those terms come from. And I bring them up because I want to talk to you about a couple of different types of business models and the different effects that they have on these terms. Separate from that, I mentioned cash flow. I learned about cash flow the hard way. How did I learn cash flow? Yes. No, net 60. Yeah, net 60. I learned about cash flow. Cash flow, you know what it is. I mean, it's pretty self-descriptive, but it actually, it's way more important than I ever thought it would be. It's the flow of cash entering and leaving the business. When people talk about cash flow, they're typically talking about liquidity, the amount of cash you actually have on hand, right? So you look at financials often on a monthly basis. You can look at last month, how we do last month. We had this much revenue, we had this much expenses. We pulled in $100,000 in revenue, and we had $80,000 expenses, that's, $20,000 profit. That's great. Except if the person that you owe $80,000 to deliver the services won't work until you pay them the $80,000, and the person that's going to give you $100,000 for the services isn't going to give you the money until you start the work, and you've only got $60,000 in the bank account, you've got a cash flow problem. Everybody's ready to transact, but there's not enough liquidity in the business to make it happen. When you have net 60 payment terms and it takes 90 days from the day you start the work to get the first paycheck, that can create issues. And so cash flow is super, super important. Okay. There are tons of business models. I want to boil them down into two very basic categories. And there are more than this, but I'm talking about public companies. I'm talking about nonprofits. And specifically thinking about this, okay, you want to parlay your skills in Python into starting a business. You're going to go one of two directions generally. You're either going to start a product company or a service company. Lofty, my company, is a service company. And so on the product side, this is just good old licensed applications, software as a service models. I know it's software as a service, but it's a product. Don't let the service and software as a service skew you. It's a service because you pay a monthly fee for it like you would pay a service retainer in a service business, but that is a product business model that they've adapted with service pricing, essentially. But that is a product company. So, any web app that you use and pay money for, or Microsoft Office, or just anything like that, right, that you license software, you're talking about a product company. Service side, freelancing, consulting, agency, you're selling at some level or another. You can package it up any way you want, but at the end of the day, you're selling people's time for money, and that's the service business model. And that's what I know best. This is what I've built a company around and what I've done for most of my career, although all of my customers tend to be on this side. We're helping them build the product. So I get a tertiary window into that business. So I know less about it, but I've seen a little bit. So there are some different attributes about these types of business models. Looking at a product company, they tend to be high margin businesses. And just as an example in SaaS, and I pulled this real stat from somewhere, but I didn't cite my source, 70 to 85% margins. So that means their cost of goods sold is 15 to 30%, and everything else is margin. What they tend to roll up in these type of companies under their cost of goods sold are their production operations. So in a software product company, this would be the payroll of the people that you need on staff to keep the production application that's printing money running, right? This is not research and development. Building new features, adding stuff to it, that's overhead. Only your production ops goes up here. Infrastructure and hosting, your AWS bill, your hosting bills, internet bill, like that sort of stuff. You can't sell a software as a service online product without having that infrastructure, so that's cost of goods sold. License fees, if you have to license some underlying technology. I know in the open source world you don't hear as much of that, but definitely there's a lot of this out there in big SaaS platforms. Transaction fees, so if you're dealing exclusively in credit cards and you're paying those credit card swipe fees, if that's the only way your customers can pay, you can't sell this product without paying them, so those are cost of goods sold. But everything else is over here in overhead, research and development. This is like probably your core dev team that's cranking out new features that hopefully get sold later and handed over to the ops team. They're over here on the overhead side. Sales and marketing, customer support, business operations, so like accounting, things like that, and facilities, your rent, toilet paper, all that sort of stuff if you have a physical office. So these are not hard rules, but these are general rules of thumb that I would say. Key attributes of product companies, they are more difficult to start because they're expensive. Why are they expensive to start? Because you can't sell anything until you actually have a product. And this is one of those things where I wish I had realized this sooner, because it would save people a lot of trouble if they realized that it's formulaic almost. You don't actually have to go out and waste money to find this out the hard way the way I did. Research and development has to be done before you build a product that you can sell. But research and development's overhead, which means that you have nothing to sell, right? If it's not a cost of goods, if it's a cost of goods sold, you can go sell it, right? And then you can take the money from the sale and you can go fund your costs on the other side. Research and development in these businesses, it can't be that way. You actually have to go build a product before you sell it. And that makes them expensive to start because building software is expensive. It's extremely labor intensive. Customer values tend to be lower in these types of companies, so you tend to have a higher volume of customers paying smaller amounts of money. And that means you have to make a lot more sales to reach profitability in these types of companies. But they scale extremely well, and that's because of the high margins. Once you have a product that's out there running, you have so much of the money that you're bringing in that can go to overhead or your pocket in your profits. And the margins tend to improve over time. So that 70, 85%, maybe you start here, but by adding efficiency, and it turns out you can double your customer base without having to double your customer support staff. Those kind of things make it where your margins actually get better over time and increase profitability. And those two things together, scaling well, margins improving over time, make these really, really attractive to investors. So it's product companies that you see going out and raising a bunch of outside capital, venture capital, angel investment, things like that. Because that's very attractive to an investor that they can put money into something, fund it, and then have something that can grow its margins over time. On the service side, things are a little bit different. You tend to have lower margins. 40 to 60% is pretty standard in almost any service-based business. I didn't know that. So remember when I said, I will keep 4 people busy and I'll keep 25% of the rate and I'll make a business out of that. I was trying to run a 25% margin. If someone had just told me that that doesn't work, and there's a million examples out there of like, these are where the margins need to be to run a successful business, I could have saved myself a lot of headache. I would have known where I needed to price myself. And that may sound a little bit crazy, this notion that if you think about a freelancer consultancy, or if you've ever worked at an agency, the notion that the business may be giving you, your salary may only be 40% of what they're billing, but the reality is that that's what it takes to build and run that company. It's pretty surprising how much it costs to go out and get those customers and land those sales and keep everyone fed. The cost of goods sold, or cost of services in a service company, structured a little bit differently. Your main thing is your billable staff. So this is actually the payroll of the people out doing the production work. Also transaction fees if you have them, and depending on your service, maybe there are some other things there. If you've ever heard the phrase time and materials, that's a billing model for services company. You charge people for the time, the labor, and also the materials. So if you have a materials cost in your business, that would roll up under cost of goods sold. If you were in construction, it would be the hour of the laborers and also the brick and stone and the things that you were building. In a software service company, you could, in theory, if you were marking up and reselling hosting, maybe this falls above the line. But everything else is overhead. Infrastructure and hosting in our business is overhead. Sales and marketing is still here. Rather than customer service, you have account management, which is just customer service with 3 more dollar signs in front of it. Operations, facilities, same deal. So the structure of how your cost of goods sold work changes the key attributes. Service companies are relatively easy to start. And that's because your service that you're providing, the thing that you're selling, there's no research and development associated with it. You're selling someone's time, and that is a cost of goods sold, which means you can go sell it right now and immediately deliver it, and there's no association. You don't have to have any upfront cash. And so if anyone's ever done, who here does freelance work or contracting? All right, so you guys know, right? You can go out and make a sale for your time and then immediately go do it. You are profitable immediately on day one because your startup cost is a cost of goods sold. That's why, right? It's fundamentally, your startup costs are a cost of goods sold. It means you can go sell it and get started. But they don't scale well. It's not that they don't scale. There are plenty of examples of big service companies. I mean, think about big management consulting firms, Deloitte and things like that. They certainly can scale. They just don't scale like a product company. It's a lot harder. And the reason why they don't scale well is the margins in a service company tend to be fixed because your cost of goods sold is controlled by the labor market. You're selling people's time. So you can't just say like, hey, Pete, we were thinking that maybe you would just cut your salary in half for the rest of your time here. Thanks for hanging out with me today. Get back to work, right? That doesn't work. And so your cost of goods sold tends to stay fixed. And that means that you don't have this R&D side on the overhead. So you can't say, cool, we'll just stop building new features. Building features is the service that you're providing. That makes them less attractive to investors. It's not that investors don't get involved. You tend to see more private equity investors than venture capital investors. So these are people that are much more institutional money that aren't looking to 10x what they put into it. And you have higher customer values. So you have a lot less customers that you're charging a lot more money, and that makes these types of businesses far more susceptible to cash flow problems, i.e., all of my revenue or a substantial portion of it is concentrated in 2 or 3 customers. If 2 out of those 3 customers don't pay their bill on time or dispute it or whatever, you can run out of cash like that. It can be within a matter of months or sometimes less in some cases. If you've heard about a major supplier to Boeing. This is a multi-billion-dollar company. Like 60% of their revenue was the Boeing Max 737 line, or 757. When that plane got grounded, they laid off 3,000 people like that day because they lost half their revenue overnight. And they were a service company. And so that was all they could do. They can't cut their cost of goods sold, so they had to cut overhead, and that was the R&D teams and things like that. So it's not that you can't get investors. There are examples of that. It's just less attractive to them. So I bring all that up to kind of talk about those 2 models and talk about the attributes. How do you go start them up? Well, there's a lot of ways, but first of all, let's talk about, okay, you're a Python developer, you're going to start a company. Well, what is Python good at? How is Python the leverage to go out and start this thing? On the product side, web applications and headless applications, although Python's not unique there. You could go do that with any kind of language, really, right? There are plenty of web languages. However, data science, ML, and AI, that is a place where Python really, really shines. You can do that in other languages, but there's a lot of momentum behind Python and R. And what you don't see is R rolling out commercialized applications. R tends to be a little bit more in the laboratory. Python tends to be the stuff that's actually getting bundled up into products that customers are paying for. Not to say that people aren't paying for art, but by and large, that's the case. So tons of product companies built on Python. Instagram was built on Django. Pinterest is built on Django. Tons of startups are built on Django. I get surprised all the time with some app that I use all the day and find out that it's Python in the back end. If you ever go to PyCon, you'll go around the sponsors and go, oh man, like Heroku's here, they're on Python. Peloton, the cycling startup, all Python. LinkedIn's got a bunch of Python in their back end. So Python's everywhere. And so on the product side, any software you can dream of, if you can build in Python. But I do think that if you're going to start a product company and Python's your secret sauce, these are the sweet spots where your skills as a Python developer give you an unfair advantage going out and starting that company. And on the service side, freelancing, contractor, agency, which is essentially what I did. I did all 3, and I ended up over there in the end. I don't like to call us an agency, but the truth is that's our business model. That's what we are.
So what's the difference between agency and consultants?
Nothing. Bill rate, maybe. Consultant is agency tends to signal creative. More, it doesn't actually mean it, but in the when people hear those terms in the business world, when you're going out and selling your services, people hear agency and they think marketing agency, design agency, ad agency. They hear consultant and they think Deloitte, PricewaterhouseCoopers, management consulting, which is all the business consulting side. I like to think that our business here at Lofty is actually truly a blend of the 2. We're on the creative side and R&D, but we also are offering strategic services and helping them plan how the software is going to work, and so kind of the best mix of the 2. So you're a Python developer, you want to go freelance contractor, start an agency. Well, web development, web-based tools or software tools that's the direction Lofty went. That's what we do, web-based applications. We specialized in really data-driven ones because Python's really good at that. But also, you can go be a freelance data scientist. You can go be a contractor data scientist. You can start a data science agency. There are quite a few of those out there. And then same thing with ML and AI. Again, that's one thing Python's really, really good at. You have an unfair advantage. There's no shortage of contract work out there for this type of thing. Lofty hires contractors all the time. If we have a short-term project that we can't justify hiring someone for a year to be on, but we need some help for a couple months, we hire contractors all the time for that sort of thing. On the consulting side, it may be less about actually building a software product as your service. You can use Python to do a whole lot of domain level stuff, logistics work, analytics work, financial work, and knowing Python can help you build tools to systemize your consulting offering. And so this is kind of I'm thinking of this as the more traditional business type consulting, where if you go in there with some programming skills and you've got some domain knowledge there, there's definitely a lot of value for freelancers and contractors, free agents in that world. Product side, two options, I guess. Raise money or don't raise money. Bootstrap it. So raise money, you give out equity like candy at Halloween because you haven't figured out that equity is not actually free, but it feels like it is because your company's not worth any money. And you take that money and you go start your R&D effort. You invest it in product development so that you have something to sell. And you can, with enough money, you can get the R&D and the sales and marketing rolling simultaneously and just go really, really fast. And that's what the whole, people raising venture capital are doing. Venture capitalists are pouring a bunch of money in, trying to get it to the next round of funding and 10x their money really quickly. Or you can bootstrap it. And that is very, very hard, going back to the fact that all of your startup costs come out of overhead. There's nothing for you to sell on day one. So as developers, though, we do have an unfair advantage here. If you're just like Business Bro and you want to start up an app, but you don't know how to write code, you're going to have to go get some money or find some way to fund it. At the very least, as developers, we can go do the R&D on our own time and do that kind of work. And there are tons of examples of product companies that someone tinkered in the evening and built the original R&D, and then maybe then went out and raised money, or maybe didn't. Basecamp is a great example. They bootstrapped. That's a $100 million SaaS platform. They never took a dime of investment. They built it internally at their agency they were running at the time, so they had that to help fund it. But there are examples of it. It's just a lot harder. It is definitely easier to do with business-to-business or enterprise-type products where your price point is higher, right? If you can build a product that solves a problem that is worth $5,000 a month to a customer, well, yeah, man, go make 3 sales and you can hire some people. You get your cash flow in $15,000 a month. I mean, people aren't getting rich, but you can cash flow from there. That's a lot harder to do when you build a product that's $5 a month. To get to the same level, you need to go out and you need to go find 15,000 paying customers. You need to reach them and market to them and keep them happy before you're cash flowing the same amount of money. So definitely bootstrapping a product company, much, much easier when you're dealing with a higher price point. So that's my recommendation. B2B. Service money, or service startup, on the other hand, you can try and raise money, but it's going to be hard to find investors that are interested in doing it. Because they know that the growth is somewhat limited. It's a little bit slow. If they have money that they want to go put to work for them, they definitely have more upside in a product company. And so people who are looking to park some money somewhere and go put it to work in a venture are probably, if they're looking at you as a service company, they're probably also looking at a product company and looking at the upside go over there going like, I don't know, that looks a lot sweeter. But it's not unheard of. People have done it. Much more likely to have success with this with private investors, not like venture capital firms. It's like friends and family, if you got them. I don't have rich family, but some people do. Or maybe some very select investors that want to get involved in something like that. Particularly if they have a skill set, like if they want to be an active partner in the business, they want to be a creative director in your firm, or they want to go out and be a producer, someone that goes out and brings in sales. But the growth is slow, margins are fixed, lower upside for the investors. Bootstrapping it, you can start that tomorrow. And for any of you who are already freelancing and consulting, you've already done it. You've bootstrapped a company. Do you guys put hands up, the ones that did freelancing consulting? Yeah. Do you think of yourself, like honestly, do you think of yourself as a business?
Yeah.
See, I got one. Yeah. If you
start with it.
Yeah. So if you don't, you should. You really should, because it helps things quite a bit. The hardest thing for freelancers, and I talked a lot about on Michael Kennedy's podcast.
Yeah.
We talked about pricing yourself was one of the big topics we talked about. Freelancers and contractors, and I've been there, we tend to price ourselves way too low because we don't actually know what we're worth. When we don't think about this, we don't go all the way back to this guy. We don't realize that if we're going to scale that up into a company, that these are the kind of margins that we need to run. So where we actually price ourselves is here. We price ourselves as one component of the cost of goods sold of our business. So think of yourself as a business. This is not the bill rate. That's just one of your costs. That's what you're taking home as a developer. If you have any ambition, like if you want to solo consultant freelance, like by all means, you don't have to try and scale it up like this. But if you have any ambition of scaling up or bringing in one more subcontractor, you need to be priced here. You need to be putting a margin on it, because you're going to find out that even with one contractor working with you, you are no longer full-time billable. You're not going to be at least fully eating. Your salary is not going to be coming exclusively from this part. But if that's all you're charging for, then suddenly all the time you put above and beyond to keep the business running and all those things are just coming directly out of your pocket. You're taking money out of one pocket and putting it in the other and pretending like you're richer at the end of the day. And so you should think about it that way. If you're doing freelancing consulting, start thinking about putting a margin on top of it. The other advice that I have just generally for any kind of company is you have to pay yourself. There's a lot of this like hustle mentality out there on the web where everyone's like, oh, you got to go grind 14 hours a day and eat peanuts and stuff. And I mean, like, you do what you got to do. Like sometimes that's what it takes. I know I've missed a lot of paychecks.
So what is the reasonable rate? Are you saying like above 200?
I'm saying that it depends on your industry. It depends on who you're selling to, and so the market has some tolerance, right? You have to be competitive with other people out there. I just mean that most people, when they think of their bill rate as a consultant, think about what they would get paid in salary as billable staff on that project. They think about, okay,
so like $65 an hour.
Yeah, and then they take that and they roll that up to an hourly rate. And what I'm saying is do that and then say, okay, that's my cost of goods sold, and I need to be running at least a 40% margin, so mark it up 40%.
You still have to cover healthcare and taxes.
You got your own healthcare and taxes. Those are things, that's overhead, by the way, on the business model side, right? When we look at our cost of goods sold, it's our billable staff, but it's not their healthcare, right? And I don't mean this in like a philosophical way. I just mean it in a purely financial way. Technically, people can just die and not have health care, and we'd still have something to sell. That's a joke, by the way.
As an example of how that went bad, on how that can go bad. So me and my buddy started a side business, and we both they presented contracts of our competitors and what their prices would be, and we were like, those jokers, we can cut them by 30%, and we'll just pay ourselves, and that's all we need. So we landed the contract. A year and a half later, we didn't realize how much time we were putting into it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to go back and say that, oh, wait, actually, we're the jokers and our price should have been
totally
competing with what everyone else is doing.
So like my main piece of advice, and this is, by the way, that's what I want to talk about. That's how you get started. Those are two kinds of business models you can leverage, and then just move to like specific questions, because I could talk a bunch about our business, different things. I think it'd be more useful for you guys if you have questions, and maybe I've got some insight, maybe not. But like major tips that I have is if you're a freelancer or contractor, you need to factor a margin into your rate because that's realistic. You have marginal costs. You certainly can't take like your yearly salary and divide that by 52 weeks and then divide that by 40 hours. Like vacation, that's overhead too. you're going to get sick and give yourself sick days, that's also overhead. Those are all the reasons why you actually need that in your margin. But especially if you start to grow it, right? If you start billing out to other people, the work of the sales, the marketing, the operations, running your invoicing, managing your bank account, like things come up, like you need to be capturing that revenue.
And I mean, if someone's interested in doing it, Windows.com has I have everybody I hire, I make them go through a class that's called Finance for the Non-Financial